Hi there, and welcome to this lecture about the Great Power Period here in Sweden. In this lecture I will focus on Charles XII and the end of the Great Power Period. My name is Marcus Henriksson and I'm a history teacher here in Sweden. So let's begin with Charles XII and his ascending to the Swedish throne. He was born in the year 1682. He was the son of Charles XI, the previous Swedish king. He loved fighting and fencing as a young kid. He was therefore by many known or called the Soldier King. At the age of 15, he took over the Swedish crown. But Sweden was then attacked by Denmark, Poland and Russia. And once again they thought that Sweden was going to be an easy prey. But if you have watched my previous lectures on the Great Power Period, you should know by now that Sweden was going to be anything but. The Swedish army was called in, and they were now known as the Carolines. Charles first intended to crush the Danes. He therefore marched the Swedish army towards the Danish capital and captured the city. Denmark was then forced to make peace with Sweden. However, the Russians had now begun to besiege the town called Narva. And you can see the town in this map, so feel free to pause the video. The Russians were many times more numerous than the Swedish army. Nevertheless, Sweden won because they had a brilliant military strategy from the earlier Swedish kings, which was basically to scare the opponent by not returning fire until they were very close. This tactic worked very well against the Russians. Basically, they got scared and then the Swedish army could divide them and take control of the battlefield. Charles then crushed the Polish army and captured their capital, so the Poles were now also out of the game. The only remaining country was Russia, and Charles intended to conquer their capital, Moscow, and force the Russians to make peace with Sweden. But the Russians made it really difficult for Sweden by burning everything that could be eaten or slept in. Russia was also more ready than before. Under Peter I, Russia had begun to modernize their army and adopt some of the tactics used by the Swedish army. Despite this, the Swedes won several battles against Russia, and they seemed to be losing this war. A decisive battle was going to take place in a town called Poltava. And you can see where Poltava is located in this map. So feel free to pause the video. The Battle of Poltava happened the year 1709. You should know that Charles XII, who was the Swedish king, he could not fight during this battle because he had been wounded in the leg. He therefore had to lay down and try to, as best as he could, give orders to his generals. During this battle we can see a total of 30,000 Swedes versus 75,000 Russians. The Swedes had around 30 guns or cannons against the Russians' 100 guns/cannons. So the Swedes were at a huge disadvantage. You should also know that the Russians had built some kind of forts or walls in order for the Swedes to have a more difficult time, considering the fact that it is a lot easier to defend something than to attack. During this battle, Charles generals began to misunderstand one another, and the disaster was a fact. A total of 8 to 10,000 Swedes died and more than 20,000 were captured. Charles then intended to flee to Turkey, and he tried as best as he could to get the Turkish Sultan to attack Russia. This attempt failed, and he was then forced to flee back home to Sweden. Denmark and Poland then used the opportunity to attack Sweden again, and the great power area or period now seemed to be almost a memory. Prussia also attacked Sweden and the territories that Sweden had in Germany, Pomerania for example. Peter I now enjoyed this victory. He began to build a new city, St. Petersburg, on Swedish soil, despite several Swedish attempts to reconquer this territory. Charles then tried to take Norway as a compensation for losing this war. So he attacked Norway in the year 1718, but once again he failed. He was shot by a bullet at the Fredrikstens fortress. To this time, historians can't really seem to agree if he was shot by his own soldiers or by the Norwegians. And the great period of power for Sweden was now over. Here is a really famous painting of the Swedish king as he lay dead and was returned back home to Sweden. So Sweden lost a bunch of territories, mostly in Germany, but also we lost Estonia, Latvia, etc. Some of our territories in Norway, and a large part of Finland. How many died during the war? Well, if the war had happened today, about 500,000 Swedes would have died. Historians who visit Sweden during this area and time found that there were many more Swedish women now than men out in the fields. The sources I have used for this video are books like History by Elisabeth Ivansson, Robert Sandberg and Mattias Tudaj, Perspective on History by Lars Hans and Örjan Nyström, History Documentary Swedish History by Martin Timell and Dick Harrison, History Documentary The 30-Year Wars, Sweden's Reign of Terror in Europe, Part 1, 2 and 3. Feel free to leave a comment, feel free to email me if you have any questions. I hope that you have learned something new in this short lecture. Bye.